Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this breakout session, this afternoon session. My name is Nina Modi. I'm a professor of neonatal medicine at Imperial College London. It's a great pleasure to be with you with four very, very experienced colleagues to talk to you about population cohorts. And in this 50-minute session, we'd like to highlight key challenges. We'd like to hear about some of the most renowned population cohorts created in the UK to follow patients over the course of their lives and collect information on their health, educational and social development. The UK has got a very, very proud and justifiably so reputation for having some magnificent life course cohorts. So I look forward very much indeed to hearing from my colleagues. We have four speakers today, and I'll be kicking off with telling you about our own National Neonatal Research Database. That'll be followed by Mike Inouye, who's Principal Research Associate from the University of Cambridge at the Systems Genomics and Population Health Unit. Then from Nick Timpson, Professor of Genetic Epidemiology at the University of Bristol. Then Angus Patrick, PPIE representative from Insight. And finally, Diana Koo, who's Professor of Life Course Epidemiology at UCL. I'm sure you'll be familiar with the format of events for today. Please do use the chat function, and please do consider this a very, very interactive session. You can type in questions to the chat function at any time throughout the presentation. I hope you enjoyed this session. Sophie, if I could have my first slides now, please. Lovely, thank you very much indeed. I hope you can all see that first slide now. I'm going to very briefly open this session by talking about the National Neonatal Research Database. This is a database that was established by my team and I at Imperial College London, and it is now in its 14th year. Next slide, please, Sophie. It is a database that relates to admissions of newborn babies to National Health Service neonatal units in England, Wales, and Scotland. It was established in 2007, and on the screen in front of you, you can see a map of the 181 neonatal units, NHS Neonatal Units in England, Wales, and Scotland. These neonatal units admit any baby who requires over and above normal care immediately after birth. So we have a range of babies. They may be full-term, extremely sick babies with multi-organ failure. They may be extremely preterm babies, and they may be babies who have anything that's over and above the normal care that any newborn baby would receive. So about 100,000 such babies are admitted to NHS neonatal units each year. To date, the National Neonatal Research Database contains information on over 1 million patients. We're unique in that we have complete population coverage of every single sick newborn baby admitted for care in the UK. And it's this that makes it globally unique. Could I have the next slide, please? Very briefly, the structure of the database is that no data are captured. Data are instead extracted out of the baby's electronic patient records. So clinical staff, very busy clinical staff, do not have to do any extra work. They simply keep the baby's electronic patient record up to date. And out of that, we extract at regular intervals a standard set of variables, very rich variables, about 450 of them, called the neonatal data set. The neonatal data set is a National Health Service information standard. And these data items, these 450 odd data items, are very clearly defined. So we extract these out of the baby's electronic patient record systems at regular intervals. We manage the data, we quality assure them, and they are then lodged in the National Neonatal Research Database. We have, as you can imagine, very comprehensive regulatory approvals, and we have a multi-professional steering board, which includes parent representatives. We are able to link to hospital episode statistics and other databases, other data sets, and as I say, we have multiple tiers of quality assurance. The National Neonatal Research Database, therefore, provides a single source of high quality data from multiple outputs. Next slide, please, Sophie. So the impacts of the NNRD are multiple benefits across the patient benefit pathway, and you can see that in the circular diagram here. There are very many different sorts of outputs that serve to improve patient benefit. There's very strong public patient involvement. Our opportunities is to link health data to other health data sets as well as non-health data sets. And we're able to make use of ever improving technical data handling advances. And also we have a number of international collaborations. However, we do have challenges in that there is increasing fragmentation within the NHS across provider units and across the 4 nations. There is also a research divide from NHS practices, and we need to do a lot more work to bring in concordances between the way in which the NHS handles data and the way in which research organisations handle data. And finally, and I know my colleagues will all grin when I say this, there's always a challenge with getting infrastructure funding. So that's a brief introduction to the start of the patient journey, the newborn baby. And now, without further ado, I will hand over to the next speaker to take over the presentations. Thank you very much indeed for listening to me.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, Nick, welcome. Over to you.
My name is Nick Timpson. So I should say, first off, thanks to everybody for having me along. Thanks to the the HDR UK team, to Nina for introducing. It's a pleasure to present on behalf of longitudinal studies today. So if you could share my slides, please, Sophie. And whilst that's coming up, so I'm a Wellcome Trust investigator with a focus on complex disease, and in particular using genetics to help unpick causality. I work or lead program packages for initiatives that are led by or funded by CRUK, NIHR, Scar-Free Foundation. I look after a PhD program in Bristol, but for today's purposes, I'm the PI of a study called Children of the 90s, or the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children. So if you could put the next slide on, Sophie, that'd be great. Thank you. So just very briefly, the Children of the 90s is a prospective study that's been running for approximately 30 years. It's as a result of its tenure, it's now a multi-generation study, and the pedigree-like diagram you can see on the right-hand side there summarizes the study. So originally, about 14,000 or so pregnant mothers were recruited into the study into the early 1990s. The product of these pregnancies became our first generation or index participants, G1 in the figure there. And then as a result of running for a long time and in the incorporation of other parts of those families, we're lucky enough to see a second generation emerging, of which we already have thousands of individuals. We have approximately 30,000 people on the books to date. And as a result of all the years worth of deep data collection and participant involvement, we've got a lot of biosamples, a huge number of data points over multiple time points, lots of longitudinal data, and we make a point of giving these data away to a large collection of international researchers. Sophie, if you could push on to the next slide, please. So thinking about impacts, challenges, and opportunities within longitudinal studies, and with a reference to Children of the 90s and the activity that we've been engaged in, I mean, at the moment, obviously, COVID is having an enormous effect and is a good exemplar for the types of things that we can do with longitudinal studies. So, and clearly the first impact to highlight is scientific advance. And what I mean by that is not just things with an academic bent, but also things where we're able to react quickly with policy relevant material and be dynamic in the way that we collect data. So that's issuing new questionnaires, and in the context of COVID, as an example, it's collecting serological data, coordinating prospective collection of questionnaire data across studies, and then working with teams of researchers in other communities, like in the UK CIC consortium with immunologists, to collect new data to understand the impact of disease. And of course, to do that, you have to then communicate, and we can leave a lasting impact by communicating and engaging with our target population and the public to make that happen. Next slide, please, Sophie. There are, of course, challenges with this, and two just to highlight of the many. So in light of COVID again, so this is an amazing illustrative impact case, but after that, and with business as usual, how do we maintain engagement and participation in our studies is clearly a challenge. On top of that, the other area that I wanted to focus on was visibility and access. Now, our assets within the UK are outstanding, but are only good to researchers if our researchers know where they are and what they contain. So finding the right infrastructure to show that off and get people using these studies is critical. And the next slide, Sophie, please. Okay, so, and just a couple of opportunities I wanted to flag today. that are particularly relevant, I think, at the moment. So electronic health records. And I use the word synergy on purpose here, because there is an opportunity in the UK to bring together large-scale electronic health record data and the deep dive bespoke designs that we see in cohorts. And that's really exciting. And the other thing, of course, is then to use examples like the current situation to capture and engage further public understanding of what we do in research and bring the population with us, which is critical to our futures. So last slide then, please, Sophie. So just to bring that together then, so impacts, what can we do? Scientific advance and engagement with the target population. Just a couple of challenges to think about. So maintenance of our studies, and alongside that, visibility and access for researchers, and clear opportunities in the future for the engagement of electronic health records at scale, but then alongside cohorts. And of course, to bring with that and to capture public understanding and contribution to research. So thanks ever so much for today, and I look forward to being involved in the discussions.
Thank you very much, Nick. And I think we now have Diana, Professor Diana Coe, is that right?
Yes, thanks very much. So I'm retired now, but I did work for 30 years on the MRC National Survey for Health and Development, which is the oldest of the British birth cohorts. That's followed them for 75 years since their birth in 1946, 5,500 of them, with hugely detailed data. And also last year for the Wellcome Trust, I recently interviewed leaders of data sharing initiatives as part of a landscape review for them on data sharing initiatives. So I'm going to call on both those long span and short span. So can I have the next slide, please? So in the UK, we're very fortunate in having a wealth of longitudinal data from birth cohort or historical cohorts that stretch back now almost 100 years. Lifetime data from these studies has provided evidence, for example, about the impact of poor lifetime socioeconomic conditions and psychosocial stress on adult physical and mental health, and how childhood development as well as prior adult health and lifetime lifestyles are associated with adult chronic diseases and functional aging. These studies survived the 20th century because of the enduring commitment of participants and study teams through times of famine as well as feast in scientific funding. So initially, many of these studies were run rather, as somebody described them, as cottage industries. However, from the end of the 20th century, they really embraced the exponential growth in intensive data facilitated by the new technologies, whether in the omics field, record linkage, imaging, or other dynamic data. So the exponential data growth brought challenges and opportunities, both in data handling. For example, even on 1,600 participants in our study, with an ActiHeart measure, it generates 30 million rows of remote sensing data. And also needing to maximize the scientific value of all this big data through the growth of interdisciplinary collaborations and team science. It led research funders to develop cohort strategies and funding data sharing platforms. And while these platforms, particularly those such as SERP, could provide a national facility for data storage, management, and sharing of cohort data, integration with cohort studies, with some notable exceptions, is as yet probably still at an early stage, but a huge potential mutual benefit. I just wanted to note, there are two time-consuming challenges for the older cohorts. The upgrading of what we call the legacy data, the sort of paper data and the data that's not on the best management systems, and the metadata. But it's vital to have these up to date in the new data infrastructure if we want to test hypotheses about how early life impacts later life outcomes. And then there's been a lot of work being done and needs to be done on what I call backwards and forwards data harmonization across these cohort studies to provide the scale needed to test hypotheses. But at the same time, each cohort study needs a unique selling point, a scientific niche, if you like, to maintain continued funding. And it's really quite a balancing act. In terms of COVID-19, these established cohort studies are really critical for assessing the long-term consequences of exposure to infection and lockdowns on the health and well-being of the population, and indeed the factors that may modify these consequences. To do this, data on pre-pandemic data are needed, along with newly collected data on the COVID-19 infections, lockdown experience, and then of course long-term follow-up to be continued. And it appears, although I'm not so involved myself now, that the cohort scientists have responded very fast to this new situation, coming together to quickly develop and process common COVID questionnaires. But the pandemic has really limited face-to-face interviews, replacing them with, so it's been an opportunity, better, maybe online questionnaires, remote data collection, but these can be challenging for older age cohorts. And so a web survey I know was just done on the 46 cohort required, and also a postal to bring the response rates up to a decent level. So there's lots to learn about these different modes of data collection. So second slide, please. So just a few points to end with for the real benefit of greater integration between cohort studies with lifetime data and the HDR UK. Bringing together scientists from these, at the moment, rather separate fields to date, again, with notable exceptions, would allow a more joined up approach to a number of things. And I've just given some examples here. I mean, clearly it would be very useful to expand the record linkage and using common contracts and tools and models across the cohort study to do that. I think the new models of effective remote access to cohort data would be, that are being developed by the data platforms, will give the widest possible data sharing and very important. It's possible that we need to have some sort of guidance on cost recovery decisions, which for different research users. I think this integration will improve findability, accessibility, and usability of data and metadata, making the data much more research ready. But again, there's lots of discussion about the level of detail of the metadata needed, for example, and how you integrate all the different types of data. But most importantly, I just think we want to we need joined up and shared training and capacity building to develop the research-ready scientists with the skills to maximize the value of these data, appreciate their value, and the need for remote access, and particularly for the sensitive data. We also need a new cadre of data managers and study managers with expertise in the longitudinal studies and study engagement, and with all the different types of data that need to be appropriately collected, stored, curated, and shared. So I think a whole exciting and rewarding career path needs to be built. So I think there's been a bit of quite a discussion about whether we need a national strategy, and I'm not going to, I think we can leave that for discussion. And I just want to end with the need for any new Population Research UK initiative will hopefully promote sustainability of high quality population science using these rich cohort studies with their lifetime data and harness the best technological changes. And to ensure high quality research outputs requires fostering high quality new data collection, as well as the efficient and effective data sharing. So data sharing is actually only worthwhile if the quality of data collected is first rate in the first place. And sustainability is particularly required at times of public health crises and funding uncertainties. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dana. Lots of interesting questions to discuss there. Let's move to our next speaker now. Angus Patrick, please.
Thank you very much. I will immediately start by saying this illustrious group of people we have here, I am the layman out of all of these people, so I may say things which are completely ridiculous, and you can choose to knock me down in flames later on if you wish. I've been involved with, on the periphery of HDR UK through the Insight group, which has been looking at bringing together an easy way for people to, researchers to access some of this data, not necessarily in longitudinal studies, but perhaps more relevant to site-based data, so imaging and genetic research that may go along with that. And part of my involvement there, very much as a layperson, is to assist with what we've called the Data Trust Advisory Board, which allows us to put a little bit of rigor and governance around looking at who needs to access the research data and how we can put some protection, perhaps, from a public point of view as much as anything else, so that we can reassure the public that the data that's being used is being used for relevant study, has both societal and medical impacts and benefits and initiatives that way. And so it's been very interesting to look at the way in which public data and patient data has been used in the past to assist with that data research. So what's been said already by a couple of the people already has been very interesting from my point of view, because I'm looking at it from an outsider. But one of the things that did strike me when have become a patient and was working towards working with the group at Moorfields who are doing an initiative called myeyesight.org, which is a way in which we can bring patients, clinicians, and other interested parties together to share some of the information that may allow better research to take place, which is typically siloed away. And I think probably one of the bigger challenges that I've noticed is that silo of data. So for example, if I go to a hospital in Oxford and have an eye test or some eye imagery done, and I go to Moorfields and have some other eye imagery done, those two things aren't connected together. And so that means that from a research point of view, you're not necessarily getting at all the data that you could easily get to. And there are some procedural challenges around that as well. For example, I would need to put together subject access requests. If you're at all familiar, I'm sure you all are with GDPR, putting together a request to actually get that data, extracting that data myself as a patient. So it's very labor intensive for not only me, it's also quite labor intensive for the trust as well, because they need to pull all that data out. And then the mysite.org project is therefore then designed for you to upload that data to allow clinicians, potentially researchers, and allow them to see what data has been collected on you to hopefully put some thought around what may be of benefit from a research point of view. So those are the couple of things that have struck me around where I've been involved with HDR UK, around the piece around some governance, etc. But looking more perhaps more widespread than that, looking at the wider population studies and the wider longitudinal stuff that's been talked about already, I looked at it from very much the other end of being a member of the public as much as anything else. But I also have, my day job is actually an IT consultant. So I'm familiar with looking at big data, and I'm familiar at looking at some of the challenges around that big data. One of the things that struck me about it is that, particularly with the studies that have just been mentioned a couple of times, that's typically where people are getting involved or have been asked to be involved in something. And one of the technology advances that we've recently experienced, of course, is that a lot more wearable technology and a lot more processed data is now becoming available just as a general matter of course. So one of the impacts that I noticed is people wearing a Fitbit pretty much 24 hours a day, or wearing an Apple Watch 24 hours a day. That's been capturing an awful lot of data for an awfully long time. I've worn one, for example, for about the last 5 years. Therefore, all my health data has been input, how many times I've brushed my teeth, how heavy I am, what my heart rate has been doing while I've been asleep. But that's all healthy patient data, which typically is, at the moment, of course, used for your own benefit. But looking forward to how we can actually start to take advantage of that means that instead of involving people potentially in a study, keeping them up to date, which is obviously a smaller data set than the general population at large, we need to think about how we may be able to securely share that information that potentially could offer some insight into where you may have an issue, or you may have some research that would point towards things that you've not necessarily looked at. So for example, I might find that I have an eye condition, and that's actually been related to the fact that I've had a certain diet, or I have had a certain amount of sleep or quality of sleep over the past 10 years. Or alternatively, I may have, more obviously, I suppose, a hearing problem, and that's been related to the noise information that can be captured on those types of devices and that kind of data that can be pulled together. I see this as being something that would be very beneficial because, as I say, it doesn't necessarily target people. It is actually looking at the data that's being collected by those people themselves as it stands at the moment. And I think probably the challenges around getting at that data is going to be how we can securely access it, how we can make sure that the public has trust that the data is being used effectively, ethically, for social benefit, etc., but also that it is completely isolated from them, and that there are no concerns over that data going out and being exposed to things that they are not comfortable with being exposed about. That links back, if you like, to where I'm involved in that data tab piece from Insight. So getting at that data, I think, is going to be key. And I think there is an awful lot of healthy data out there from healthy people that could have an impact as time goes by with more and more data being collected. And we need to make sure that we can find a way to engage with the public to do that in a much bigger scale, potentially leveraging some machine learning to develop some patterns and techniques which may well help. So that's me. I will now hand over to Mike, I believe.
Thank you very much, Angus. Very interesting to hear the real lived experience, as it were. And now, last but certainly not least, Mike, welcome.
Thanks, Nina. Just waiting for the slides. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. My name's Mike Noye, obviously. I lead a team of analysts. So I'm going to kind of shift gears here and give you a little bit of a perspective, pretty much a high-level view of some of the analysis opportunities and challenges in analyzing population scale data. Next slide. So many of you are probably familiar with some of the opportunities inherent in population scale data and data through our lifetimes. These are not surprises, but just to cover them, a few selected ones. So obviously, from an analysis perspective, what we can do with the data is various sort of things, which include, say, risk prediction, which include identifying, say, high risk or low risk subgroups of individuals who may benefit from therapies or public health interventions. Risk prediction may affect screening strategies, when or who might be brought in for testing. It may affect, how we might do intervention strategies. So, who we might give a particular, or basically who we might give a particular therapy to, how we might calculate things like efficiencies and benefit versus harm, how that would then factor into health economic analyses and cost effectiveness. So there's a lot of real opportunities beneath risk prediction. My lab in particular is involved in various aspects of that from the cardiovascular point of view and integrating genetics and polygenic risk into cardiovascular risk prediction. The other aspect, obviously, which pairs very nicely with risk prediction is etiological. So what are the causal factors which affect disease onset and, for example, say, therapy response? So these can run the gamut from genetic factors, so genes, to molecules, proteins, metabolites, et cetera, through to behavioral and environmental factors. Nick mentioned, using genetics for causality, so Mendelian randomization. That can be quite useful. And also, say, also when it comes to etiology, correlations can be quite useful. And also there's a kind of growing sort of interest in life course modeling. So how best do we model, say the full life course? So when you have, serial sampling, longitudinal data, how do we model that sort of thing? And what sort of insights can we bring from that? Can we extract from that? Obviously, with the scale of data that's available in the UK, it's phenomenal. I think Nina was very much correct in pointing out that we've got incredible data assets at our disposal, very large sample sizes. Importantly, from an analysis perspective, obviously the bigger the N, the better, and also having independent, multiple external data sets, as we like to call them. So data sets that have been collected and have been collected, and the designs are very similar. And you can then say, do much more robust statistical or machine learning on statistical analysis or machine learning on those data sets. And of course, there's also the depth of the data available, so larger and many times more targeted and more relevant feature sets, which are available for the analyst on the ground, which can be quite useful. It presents challenges as well in terms of dimensionality of the data. But when it comes to measuring all the variables instead of a selected subset, that's obviously advantageous from an analyst perspective because you're not missing things. So in terms of actually working with the data, I'm not going to go into the massive sort of field that is machine learning and AI. Those techniques are quite useful and also take advantage of the data in terms of say risk prediction or looking at causal factors. We can talk a bit more about that later. From an analyst perspective, there's also a lot of opportunity in terms of developing algorithms and software as well. And this very much is a virtuous cycle. Feeds into all sorts of things, helps facilitate and open up new doors. It sort of alleviates a lot of the scale challenges in utilizing big data. So from an analyst perspective, from that person in the corner at the desk who's got their, who's just staring at their computer all day, this can be quite a useful and fruitful endeavor. And obviously, in working with such excellent and health data, it is very near, well, relatively near translation as far as, well, say other data types that data scientists work with. So next slide. And a few of the challenges, and this is in leading a group of a couple dozen analysts, we spend a ton of our time on actually. So the opportunities are great. When we get there and achieve them, that's fantastic. But much of our time is spent, in the trenches, the analysis trenches, on things like removing and controlling unwanted variation in our data. So this is, say bog standard quality control, like how good is the data of the assay or of the health record, et cetera. And how can we, what sort of filtering strategies do we need to do? You might consider missingness part of quality control. So data missingness is a major challenge. I mean, that's a whole area and ways of modeling missingness, imputing missingness, how you best control it in your analyses. How we deal with confounding and bias is a major factor, and I think that also speaks to understand the analysts themselves, understanding the study design and how data has been handled in the lead up to everything right up until the data set itself makes it to the analyst desk. They need to understand the history of that data. Who did what are the potential sources of confounding and bias? Because every data set has confounders and has selection biases and various other types of bias in them. And from an analyst perspective, they need to know what those are, because there are some pretty sophisticated techniques to handle that. A lot of the day-to-day aspects, the challenges for the analysts involve the working environment. So obviously there's all sorts of issues around making sure that you're working in a trusted and secure environment and appropriately handling the valuable data that we've got. But it's also, there is a trade-off with, the ease of actually working in that environment and how stable it is, how much, how difficult it is, how slow it is, even we have connection issues, that sort of thing. So, a lot of these things are very real kind of, day-to-day challenges. And the question really arises, can an analyst, sanely work on it, remotely logging in and working at the command line day to day. This does kind of relate to systems administration, which is kind of more, not necessarily from the analyst perspective, but is very much sort of something that we engage with a lot of the time. So, where is the data? What are the permissions for the data? Who can, or who's, obviously, you may have access to a particular data set, but who's the person who has the jurisdiction, the ability to actually flip the switch and give you you can actually use the data now. So those are very real issues. Having good systems admin for the environment that you're working on is very important. Scalability. So a lot of compute environments that we work in, They're very secure, they're very trusted, etc. But they don't have enough CPUs or GPUs or memory available to actually do the modeling, the machine learning, deep learning, etc. that that would really take advantage of these data. So I know there's a lot of work being done on that, and also making it flexible as well, which is very important. There's a lot of heterogeneous computing infrastructures that are necessary to handle the diverse data types that are part of the data sets we work with. Importantly, interoperability. So how do we compare across data sets, similar data across data sets? So ideally, you'd have the exact same assay run in cohort A and in cohort B, but typically that's not the case. How do we actually model the differences, the technical and unwanted differences between those two things? Potentially, how do we, what sort of transformations can we use? How do we, increase the interoperability is a major source of day-to-day challenge. And also, importantly, and this isn't just like this isn't necessarily an analyst specific thing, but it's how do we actually control and address sources of inequity, right? So there can be ethnicity biases in the data. It could be representative of just say European ancestries. That's frequently an issue and obviously limits the generalizability and the conclusions and the usability or the usefulness of the analyses and the results that come out of that data. We do a lot of work on that in the genetic space because a lot of the cohorts and genotyping that followed were based on largely European ancestry cohorts. So we do try and generalize that to other ethnicities. And obviously that also relates to socioeconomic status, making sure that we're not just analyzing unusually healthy populations. What sort of techniques, for example, risk recalibration, might we need to use to say go from a healthier population and make our analyses more generalizable to the general population or to less healthy populations. So what sort of techniques are useful there? So hopefully I've given you a little but of a high-level view of from an analyst perspective of the opportunities and challenges inherent in these data, and hopefully makes you think about it from that perspective as well.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's a great pity that we don't have a week for this symposium or even a whole day for this symposium. So many things to talk about. We've got a great question that's come in from Wenhua Li, who says, in relation to our longitudinal studies, birth cohort studies, given that new data types are coming in all the time from, for example, new technologies, new scans, new detection, how can we integrate these into the existing cohorts, and how can we create very expeditious ways in which to gain consent from participants? In other words, would someone like to tell us about longitudinal consent processes? Let me ask Nick first of all. Angus, could I ask you to turn on your video, please, too? Nick, would you like to comment first?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Nina. And it's a great question. So I think there's a couple of things going on here. So as a longitudinal study, one is always thinking about the balance between existing prospective data and its nature and the challenge and the excitement of getting new things in. Because of course, and as I think it was mentioned, I think Nina by yourself and others during the talks, is that we like to compare things before events and things after events. And that's one of the great things that we can do using the longitudinal studies. As a result of that, consenting in most longitudinal studies is a dynamic process and something that happens regularly and is updated, and indeed is a situation that can be generic across a study involvement, but also specific to an individual part of a study or a project within a study. So as a result of that, actually, because of that dynamism, it is possible to incorporate new things. And if one can get over the hurdle of making it relevant to the past data, then actually new technologies are really, really exciting. And we do it all the time, so we've been using actigraphy, and Di mentioned lots of interesting, exciting things about that. And I think Angus as well, the notion of bringing in wearables and alternative technologies. There's instances in our studies where we have now real-time video recordings of child and mother interactions in the home, and that can only be afforded through new technologies that offer remote data capture in real time. So it's a context question, I think. The embracing of new technology is terrific and we want to do it, but we're always thinking about getting the most out of the shape and nature of the study in order to make that possible. And of course, that sits in the context of the points made rightly by Angus in terms of data security and the appropriate processing of those data. Does that help?
Thank you very much, Nick, and thanks for bringing in the issue of the wearables, because I'd like to bring Angus in now, please, because one of the issues that we have to contend with our neonatal research database is what approach should we use as the children grow older. So the oldest children in our database are now 14 years old. What approach should we use to obtain to provide ongoing information and seek ongoing consent to hold their data as they grow older and as we wish to contact them themselves as opposed to their parents? Do you have any thoughts about systematic capture of longitudinal consent and systematic provision of information about the purposes for which these data are being held?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It comes down to that public engagement and that public confidence to a certain extent, I think, around where the data is going to be used and what the data is going to be used for. And looking at it again from that kind of specific area of saying, well, there are a specific group of people we want to ensure can stay with us, if you like. That security and that confidence in what the data is going to be used for, I think, is fairly key. The wearables piece, I think, feeds into it quite nicely, because there is a potential there for a centralized way in which that can be handled. At the moment, you'll probably be familiar with when you sign into your device or you sign into your Apple Watch or whatever it might be, it says, when you first set it up, it'll say, we're going to share your data or share diagnostic data with Apple. So leveraging that centralized approach from providers, Fitbit, Apple, Google, whatever it might be, and saying, are you comfortable with this being shared with, anonymized, shared with providers for research that are looking at potentially uncorrelated or not obviously correlated data? So I mentioned earlier on around noise. I get no alert to say if it's too noisy, but it's also tracking my ambient and environmental noise all the time to find out what I'm exposed to and what I'm exposed to over a long-term basis. So from a hearing point of view, that'd be quite useful. And I think it's therefore around potentially looking at the providers, a little like we did for the COVID response, where trying to put together an app that was individual to each country wasn't necessarily going to work. And you needed to look at the providers like Google and Apple to enable APIs to allow that to happen, and then put a mechanism in place that allows people to contribute and accept the way in which their data is going to be used.
Thank you, Angus. And I'd like to bring Diana in as well, because Diana, you have the experience of looking after the longest lasting cohort. What have you any reflections on how approaches to obtaining longitudinal consent and providing longitudinal information have evolved over the decades?
Well, there's a whole history to the history of consent. So it was only in the mid-80s that we even had to ask consent. Up until then, if people answered the questionnaires, let the nurses in the door, that was all that was expected. So there's been a huge shift. And of course, and in fact, our study members who've been in the study for 75 years and know more than the nurses do when they come, get quite annoyed that we have to go through these pages and pages of consents every time, because as things have developed. But you know, we explain that to them, and we have and I think one of the interesting consents that's coming up now that we've managed to get is to actually, you know, if you're studying aging, you want to make sure you've got future consent, because you want to study people as they do get ill and maybe lose functioning. And we've been actually, because you know, studies like RSPAC and our study, we know our study members so well, the nurses can actually have, we found a way of asking for, you know, if something like, you know, if you aren't able to give consent in the future, would you still want to remain in the study? And that's a really sensitive thing to ask about, but it's been incredibly helpful later on when some of our study members have, for example, got dementia, and you know, and their next of kin are really keen to know what they said at that time. I think just going back to also your question about the merging of all the different kinds of data, you know, I think we do have really complex types of data now, and there is a danger that so many groups reinvent the wheel, and that we need, you know, I've been really, I mean, I was really interested to, for example, we interviewed on the landscaping review, the European Bioinformatics Institute. And, you know, there are these specialist data repositories now that can really help the longitudinal studies really make the best use of being able to store and curate those data. And, you know, I think imaging data is going that way, but hasn't kind of reached that point yet, because you can't, you know, you've got to be able to make sense of 30 million rows of data for the acting art. Excuse me. And there are lots of, you know, people are, obviously it's good that people try different ways, but I think, you know, over time we need to find the best and the highest quality ways of those data, and then being able to merge that in, so we can look at all the data sets together. And I think that's where HDR UK is going to be a hugely important resource for the population studies.
Thank you very much. Now we're rapidly running out of time, but there are two questions I would like to pose, one to the whole group, which we'll end with. But before that, very quickly, Mike, could you just tell us very quickly whether or not you feel that interoperability aspects between UK datasets, never mind international datasets, but UK datasets, are actually proceeding at the kind of pace that we would like to see? Very quickly, please, because I've got a final question for the whole group.
Look, it's a great question and a tough one. I mean, really, I think I work very much in the molecular space, and I think from a genetics point of view, when it comes to array and sequencing, the technology is pretty robust in terms of interoperability and even backwards compatibility. So I think we're doing well on that side. The UK is clearly world leading in that space. In other, in other data types, when it comes to interoperability, particularly when it comes to molecular or otherwise, I think there's still a lot to do, and I don't have a good sense of the scale of the problem, but certainly, I mean, you can never run too fast when it comes to this sort of thing. So I think you know, there's a lot to do. And you know, what we have currently, and Diana, you know, very much pointed out, not reinventing the wheel. We need to put in a lot of sweat in terms of, you know, utilizing what we have and using the analytics techniques to increase the interoperability and seeing what we do instead of.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. And last question for the entire team, please, because a very great question from David Seymour. He asked, can you point to any gaps in terms of longitudinal cohorts, population cohorts? Can you think of any gaps in the UK's offer at the moment? Let's go one by one. Nick.
Unmute myself. Yes, right. So what have we got? We have not got representation in UK cohorts, and we don't claim that we have. So, you know, careful consideration of where cohorts are great is excellent, but there are of course holes, different cities, different ethnicities, different ages, different tenure of projects. We
need whole populations. My database is a whole population one, but I absolutely agree with you. We do need good representation. Diana. Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry, no, I know I'm muted. It's very hard to demute on this for some reason today. I think, you know, the cohorts really vary as to whether they, how representative they are and also how big they are. And it's also about putting the cohorts together. But I think when there was an analysis done a few years ago that the gap we were also missing were people in their sort of 30s and 40s. And I'm not sure that ever got filled. So that's something that I don't know whether there's a way of doing that now.
Okay, so we've got representative.
But I mean, one of the benefits of, can I just say, of these cohorts is that they really have healthy individuals. It's very different from having a clinical cohort. So you've got people with a whole range, the whole spectrum, And although we have their clinical records where we can, we have a spectrum of their health measures, you know, in terms of their functioning and things. And that's really important to be able to compare the life trajectories of people who go, you know, in and out of health, and also to look at the ones who stay healthy, even though they have the same exposures, you know, they're resilient, even though they have the same exposures of people who don't get healthy. So those are some of the questions that these studies can ask across the life course that complement the clinical studies.
Thank you. And final word from Angus. Any gaps, Angus, that you'd like to point or highlight?
Yeah, I think I'm looking at it from a, forgive me, I'm in IT, so I'm looking at it from a technology gap, really. And it's, you can see the advances that are being made. Recent Apple Watch now, it looks at O2 measurements and VO2 max. It doesn't look at temperature, and I think temperature is going to have an effect. So more and more sensors are going to get built into that wearable technology so that you don't feel that you're having to look at what it is that you're monitoring. It's monitoring such a more widespread amount of stuff. So I think that's probably where there is a gap at the moment, is that it's not monitoring deeply enough. And as time goes on over the course of the next 10 years, that embedded wearable technology, which is looking at more and more sensors to investigate more and more data, is going to fill those gaps through technology, I suspect.
Great. Well, I'm afraid we're 2 minutes over already. Forgive me for being a bad chairman, but it's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much, Sophie, James, for organising this. And thank you, everyone. It's been lovely to meet you and lovely to have this discussion with you. Many thanks.